The Hundred Years' War was fought between France and England from 1337 to 1453, which is actually longer than 100 years. The war was not fought continuously, it was fought in different phases, and England won three out of five of the most significant battles.
The first battle of the Hundred Years' War was the Battle of Crécy. It was fought at the village of Crécy in northern France, and it went into history for the disastrous defeat of the French, despite that they had a very powerful army. The victory at Crécy enabled Edward III to lay siege to Calais and force the city defenders to surrender the city 1 year later.
The second battle of the Hundred Years' War was the Battle of Poitiers. It was the greatest victory for England, and the English longbowmen played the decisive role in the outcome of the battle. The French king, who was King John II, was captured during this battle and taken to England. He was released in 1360 after he promised to pay an enormous ransom.
Go for blood.
The third battle was the Battle of Agincourt in 1450. The battle marked the last of the three brilliant English victories in the Hundred-Year War against France. The English that was forced by King Henry V defeated the French army and conquered a lot of land. The English failed to achieve this victory, which entered into a new phase and gradually turned into French's favor.
Manorialism is an economic arrangement between lords and serfs. The serfs take care of the lord's lands and animals, and in return for the work, the lords provide them with food, gives them strips of farmland, and protection. With feudalism, the social class system goes from highest to lowest: the kings, the lords, the church and the knights, the merchants, and then finally the serfs and the slaves. It was for a matter of security for the kings in Europe, so that way they could divide up parts of the land down the social caste system, and they wouldn't have to look over such a large area at one time. In the feudal system, it was very beneficial for the king because all he had to do was share some of his land, and in return he received food, labor, protection, and military service, money, and also knights.
The central issue of the 100 Years' War was that neither the French nor English could decide on who owned the land.
The most important effect of the Hundred Years' War was that the English territory and France was confined to the Channel port of Calais. After the war, the English then started to look at problems of internal development. The Treaty of Bretigny was a treaty that was drafted on May 8th in 1360. It was then ratified on the 24th of October in 1360. This treaty was signed by King Edward III of England and King John II of France. This treaty marked the end of the first phase of the Hundred Years' War. The legacy of the treaty was that it did not lead to long peace, and it procured 9 years respite from the 100 Years' War. Edward the Black Prince was a great military leader. His wins against the French were very impressive, and he was the first Knight of the Garter in 1348. All of England called him Leonor, and he was named Edward after his father, but the royal records most oftenly call him the Black Prince due to his maternal ancestry. Unfortunately, after a long illness that he got 10 years earlier while he was campaigning in Spain, the prince returned to England in January 1372 and died on June 8th. Therefore, the throne was then passed on to Richard II. After the Battle of Agincourt, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. The Treaty of Troyes was an agreement that King Henry V of England and his heirs would inherit the throne of France upon the death of King Charles VI of France. It was signed in the French city of Troyes on May 21st in 1420. The Siege of Orleans was the watershed of the Hundred Years' War. It was the French Royal Army's first major military victory while Joan of Arc was with the army. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in France, and she was a national hero of France. At the age of 18, she led the French army to a victory over English at Orleans. She was captured 1 year later, and Joan was burned at the stake by the English and their French collaborators. The siege of Orleans took place in the late stages of the war. The city that it took place in was a symbolic significance to both sides of the war. The siege collapsed 9 days after Joan's arrival, and after it collapsed, the English did not consider themselves defeated. Finally was the Battle of Castillon. It was fought on July 17th in 1453 in Gascony. It was a decisive French victory, and it was considered to be the end mark of the 100 Years' War. In the aftermath of the war, the English lost all holdings in France except for Calais, which is a town and major ferry port in northern France.
Did you know the English longbow played a large part in their victory? It could fire faster and farther than the French crossbow. The war had a lot to do with transforming France from a number of feudal lands to a national state. The war stopped for a long period during the Black Death of the Bubonic Plague. Historians often split the war into three main periods: the Edwardian War from 1337 to 1360, the Caroline War from 1369 to 1389, and the Lancastrian War from 1415 to 1453. The 100 Years' War really didn't last 100 years, but 116 years. That means a lot of people lived their entire lives while the war was going on.
I was always gonna start. Okay, the Hundred Years' War was fought between France and England over the French throne from 1357 It's 1337. The 100-Year War was between France and England. The 100-Year War was fought between France and England over the French throne from 1453 to so they're off 1313. The 100 Years' War was fought between France and England over the French throne from 1337 to 1453, which was actually longer than 100 years. So,
Tell me when. The battle was the Battle of